What is up, guys? So I'm typically not one to buy upgrades for paintball guns, as I find like bolts and most of these upgrade parts really don't do all that much. But because I use my EMech so much and you guys use EMechs so often, I bought this trigger to see what it was like, but really just to make this video. The EMech trigger, a 100% aluminum adjustable trigger, and it also has 2 ball bearings inside there to kind of help smooth out or speed that trigger up. So those 2 adjustment spots are for post-travel and pre-travel. That post-travel is going to be how far the trigger moves back, and the pre-travel is going to be how far the trigger moves forward. So why even change the EMech trigger? Mainly because it's pretty long, and this EMach trigger is adjustable, so we can make it not long. And the whole reason Planet Eclipse is making the trigger long really is kind of for 2 reasons. Cost, they wanted to keep that gun affordable, and then adding the ball bearings and adjustment points like this EMech trigger just increases the cost of the trigger, and then would increase the cost of the gun. And then also for simplicity, a lot of these $200 paintball guns like this EMech are ending up in the hands of like rental players and new players, and the less stuff that can go wrong and the less that they mess with, the better. Because we always see this, right? When like brand new players are buying high-end guns or even these mid-range guns, and they really kind of don't know what's going on and start like turning stuff and tweaking it and messing the whole thing up. So the simpler, the better with all these like cheap guns. So there's those 2 things, cost, so keeping that gun cheaper, and then functionality, just making it easier for the end user. But there's another thing we're gonna say, reliability. So having that trigger travel a little bit further forward and back adds a little bit of room for error. So say you get shot in the trigger, paint gets all gooey and gummed up in there, and then the trigger can't travel forward as far as it normally does. If we had the trigger adjusted just far enough forward, getting that paint in there might not allow the trigger to work correctly. So having that little bit of slop, making that trigger longer than is needed, makes a little bit of room for error if something goes wrong. So having those adjustment points just allows us to dial in how long that trigger is. So we're gonna switch this camera angle around and install this trigger, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more. Okay, let's install this thing. So the first thing we wanna do is remove these frame screws. Pretty simple, you just really remove these frame screws. And since this gun's electric, we don't really have any like eye wires or batteries to worry about. So these 2 screws come right out. You can already see the frame falling off, and just comes apart really easy. To remove the trigger, there is a trigger plate right here that does have 4 screws that we need to remove. And I really dislike this screwdriver, but I don't know where my good one's at. This is a little bit big. So removing these screws is kind of annoying. It's gotta be like perfectly in there. It's pretty easy though. They come right off, and I think I got them all the way out. I like to try to leave those screws in there. It makes putting that plate on a little bit easier. Then that safety pulls right out. We can pop off that trigger spring, just put it wherever. And then we have to remove that trigger pin right there. That knurled side is the side that goes out. So we need to flip this around. I'm gonna use the point of my screwdriver to push on the pin, and it starts going out. To push it the rest of the way, I'm just gonna use this Allen wrench, and pins right out. Then trigger plops right out. So these do have their own pin as well. So we can see, maybe if I bring that a little closer, you can see that pin right there is that knurled side, and then the smooth one is gonna be the pin that comes with that EMach trigger. One that comes with the trigger is a little bit smaller in diameter and is gonna fit those ball bearings a little bit better. So we're gonna put trigger in. I might actually speed this up. If this like takes me a little bit longer, we might just speed, see, pins getting stuck in the net. It might speed this section up. Yeah, we're gonna speed this whole thing up. As really, it's just kind of like redoing what we already went through. Okay, see, I screwed up. You gotta put the safety in before you put that trigger plate on. But you really don't need to. So I've taken apart these guns before. So if we just loosen the trigger plate a little bit, you can actually, I think, pull up the plate just enough to allow that safety to kind of slide right under it, like that. And then we'll tighten this down and then speed up the video again. Bingo. You also maybe notice that I did not include that trigger spring. So with these guns, there's enough pressure pushing forward on the trigger from that three-way inside. You don't really have to use that trigger spring. So you get rid of it and lighten up the trigger a little bit. So that's installed. Let's go back over there and talk about this. So the trigger feels better. It's definitely shorter, but it's not crazy shorter, like maybe 15% shorter. So like if you have a stock gun in your hand and then one with the EMach trigger, you'd notice the difference, but it's not dramatic. I think the biggest difference for me is it just kind of feels all around like a better trigger, right? It's just made a little bit nicer. These triggers on the EMachs are kind of inexpensive. That's the whole point, right? To keep these guns a little bit cheaper. But the EMach trigger, I feel like has a nicer finish to it. That gloss finish definitely feels nicer. Those ball bearings are very smooth, and the trigger just feels a little bit smoother, I think because of those ball bearings mainly. The trigger is also a bit longer, and having that extra length just adds a little bit more leverage to the trigger. So pulling on the very bottom, I definitely noticed that the trigger is a little bit lighter and easier to pull, but it is a longer trigger pull when you're pulling on the bottom. So I don't know necessarily if, you know, having that added leverage, that like easier pull makes all that much of a difference, just because the trigger ends up being longer. So it's easier to pull, but you're, you know, pulling it further. But overall, with the trigger adjusted and taking the trigger spring out, it is definitely noticeable. And I would say that, I don't know, with the trigger adjusted and that spring out, I don't know, I'm probably adding like maybe 2 balls a second to my rate of fire. Not a ton, where I could shoot maybe 6, maybe 7. Now I can get maybe into that 9 balls a second category. And that is fast for a mechanical gun. So the reason the trigger is only 15% shorter is because of the three-way on the inside of the grip frame. Inside of that three-way is a spool, and that spool has to travel all the way forward for the gun to like reset itself, and then all the way back for the gun to fire. So you can't really like, you know, make the trigger like a millimeter long, because that spool wouldn't like reset or travel back far enough for the gun to fire. That's not like weird. Most all electronic paintball guns also have a design somewhat similar to this. They're just using electricity and magnets to help shuttle that spool back and forth extremely fast. Like way faster than your trigger finger is ever gonna do. That's the only reason like the electric guns shoot fast, is because they're using power to shuttle that spool back and forth, not your fingers. So we've seen someone make a trigger shorter. It's also possible we see someone in the future make a different spool or three-way for the EMechs. It's not like a crazy design, so making a shorter one is definitely a possibility. So I like it. I think for $40, it's a very good deal and a worthy upgrade for most of you EMech owners. I mean, 40 bucks is a good deal. I mean, we gotta think like machining and anodizing, those ball bearings cost money, the pin, sourcing materials, all that stuff costs quite a bit of money. So for 40 bucks, it's a pretty good deal. I like them. There's a link in the description if you wanna pick this thing up.